I'm Ryan O'Dowd, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today I continue with section 418 of The Omega Seed by Paolo Soleri. We're moving on in Book 6, The Technological Frankenstein and the Delphic Oracle. The Mediocrity of Intolerance. It is paradoxical that a certain dosage of wisdom is necessary to become wise, the paradox of youth having to go about knowing. It's misleading and cruel on the part of the teacher to consign the world to the student on the terms that we are all created equal, that we are all innately good, and that we are all creative. The consequence of such bland innocence is mediocrity and intolerance. When experience is a dirty word, the password becomes, do your own thing, the sooner the better. A person is not born mediocre, but most of all the traps reality puts on the path of life, the trap of mediocrity is the most frequent and the most prevalent. Rejection of a humble attitude toward the experience of growth, an experience which includes the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly, encountered by our fathers and mothers, is a sure path to mediocrity. A mediocrity of the most rigid kind, as it is made not only the stuff of arrogance, but also the stuff of intolerance, and is locked away from compassion and is locked off from knowledge. It is important to note that such a trap increases the hold of fate on a person. This closing of an individual in the deterministic cage is antithetical to the handling of one's own destiny, by dealing with the fatal deterministic entropic blows of life. This is so for the simple reason arrogance and intolerance are willful states of ignorance and therefore mediocre. Such a state is blinding to the senses and blinding to the mind. It is a desensitizing condition given to the fire of resentment, and with time and favorable conditions the crushing fury of hatred, i.e. the Nazi ethos. It's tragic to see the impetuous of youth turn into a petrifier of itself, on the spurious assumption that one has got it all at the outset, and all that is left to do is hammer oneself and one's brother-sister into that sphere of reference. Conservatism at such an early, green, untempered, uninformed, ignorant stage cannot but be reactionary, entropic, brutally pollutant to the life of the spirit, the life that truly shrouds, comprehensively and compassionately, all of us, the deprived, the blue and white transparent collar workers, the unemployed, the poor, the rich, the famine, the victims and victimizers, wise and arrogant, gentle and intolerant. One should try to begin one's own life history as a container healthy and as beautifully open as can be, genetically adaptive and able to build upon itself while filling up to capacity. As a container grows, its capacity does likewise, but the filling content, the information load from the outer, does not line up to the growing brim on what one might call a congruous schedule. Thus, as the container enlarges, the content enriches to the point where it must overflow. This overflow is a restitution, a payment of debt in new and original coins of information transformed into knowledge and possibly creation. If this were the mode, then, for instance, the challenge of idea, and that an idea can withstand challenge, could be given a truly open hearing. That is to say, an idea could be challenged only after it had been understood, and it could not be challenged at all if such understanding were not reached. This is the old story of the crime done to ideas, assassination, perpetuated by people, clubs, corporations, governments, parties, etc., and it should be most repellent to the anti-establishment young. Is the young person of today strongly opinionated and in truth a very poor listener, better off than the meek, gullible, ready-to-be molded young person of tradition? Simply not. He is self-righteous, self-pitying, perhaps hypocritically sensitive to the suffering of others, but most of all, he has himself in an ironclad bigotry that often will destroy him in the learning assimilative volitional temper. Very little comes through which is not of a familiar ring, a very restricted breadth of understanding for the simple if contextual reason of being a beginner in the game. With the whole universe to learn from, with the wealth of means available for such learning, with the stern demands of durational time parceling growth at an exhilarating pace, with generosity exuding from the marrow of our bones, with so much to understand and revere, with so much existential hardship tangible and desperate, how cowardly can our junketing for self-gratification be? Such a sight in the young gives one a slight sense of existential nausea. But in such a setting we find ourselves, if we let ourselves be caged by a limited set of values, whose originators are, by the specific quality of originator, of an uncommon temper. One set of values is substituted for another, impatience instead of patience, arrogance for humility, mistrust for trust, cynicism for questioning, license for tradition, information for learning, insularity for universality, mood for discipline, change for growth, etc. Much of it is purely conceptual, as it has not had the time to become contextual, and so has the stiffness of a newborn calf, the flimsiness of a house of cards, the presumption of an unrepentant self-esteem. The critical assumption is, in fact, well hidden in the simplistic folds of presumption, arrogance, and ignorance. As I am, the only true concern for me, as I am. A specific fragment of youth on a grab binge. This is ignorance of the dynamics of becoming, of the slow, eventful, open growing up. This mistrust of anyone above 30, a classic statement of cannibalistic cynicism, is a tight corset on the soul and stunts its growth. If one is so full of oneself because of the minimal information and experiences collected in a short lifetime, and if one becomes magnetized and polarized by the magic of the mob and the sweetness of the consensus, one fills with contempt and fury and shuts tight the door of any information knocking at it that does not conform to a spare frame of understanding. What occurs is substitution of the frame of reference, certainly imperfect, of a society of hundreds of successive generations' traditions, with a frame of reference of a society one half in so generation in length, based only on the studiously weak assumption that truth has suddenly exploded within the collective heart of the generation of the 60s, chosen out of 1,000 past and million futures. Two institutions have supported and fed this diffuse state of the psyche. First, a number of intellectuals, neighbors of Spiro's pseudo-intellectuals, professors, instructors, and counselors who, out of generosity, conviction, opportunism, pessimism, cynicism, or ignorance, have blown on the fire of youth and made use of its penchant for prankishness and turbulence. Some of these exploits, panty raids and the like, often contain more wisdom than we are willing to concede. With a poorly radicalized indignation toward the blunders of the past, and with a few skeletal models, the pounding and forming of a brittle conscience based on a not-so-original molds has come to destroy past idols and institute a new mythology as saturated with conformity as the one almost gluttonously torn to shreds. The other institution is the electronic onslaught and its double and inseparable form of linear information and nonlinear, non-conceptual information. News and images, sounds to put it roughly, directed at soma and soul almost indiscriminately, massively, and at least on the news side, abstractly, information, not experience. It's a mix of relatively low quality, emotional, moral, economic, politic, and cultural, manipulated bits sold as hard information. Furthermore, and more seriously for the morality involved, it's often of a content that savagely and absurdly denounces the medium. The song reaching the person by way of sophisticated artifices, marked if not stigmatized by the same and executed through them, is an apology of primitive man, the pure, sincere, impaired, free, spontaneous, generous animal just outside the gates of Eden. The inner fraud cannot forever stay bottled in the retorts of techno-dollar nouveau barbarism-rich labs, but it is seemingly there now as the rawhide of the youth's soul vibrates and reaches into the collectivized and superficial ethos of the tribe. No questions asked, no indictment dared. There is then the Dionysian and pretty gross melting in the pot of sounds and images with pot plus drugs, and the array of indigestible avalanching information, contradictory, fearful, irrelevant, malicious, unbelievable, disconnected, fractionalized, urging at both the guts and the temples of an arrogantly disposed youth, verbally engaged in vostra culpa mea grazia, your fault for the grace of me, destructive and hopelessly lost in garble and utopian tirades. Might it be of some merit to offer the idea of a withdrawal methodology, seeking to remove the person from the group into a quiet environment to feed on relatively little but fertile information, sequential and linear, given time and favorable conditions for assimilation maturation? Though such a program might seem fairly static and incongruous with the dynamism of the information generation, it would be possibly a reconciliation of those dynamics, which are often pure massive randomness of exterior origin, with inner dynamics of which physiological growth is a miraculous example. Today, self-pity and presumption are hooked to a frame of reference too shaky for comfort, and shaky it must be as the learning process in the young has just begun and is in dire danger of being stunted by a prematurely slammed door, and therefore becoming too exclusive and segregative. This confusion, this self-righteousness and scantiness of lived experience of growing up, is the hotbed of arrogance and intolerance, even if it is often hidden by a vest of gentleness and candor. An apology of routine might be in order here, since the fine art of living cannot be perceived and performed until the virtue of routine is also perceived. But the appreciation of routine comes hard to youth, since time is of the essence in the ritualization of the most simple acts, of which most of our lives are made. A culture is the embodiment of life routinized, and of the transcendence that will be exuded by its fitness to the human condition. Thus concludes The Mediocrity of Intolerance in Book 6, Technological Frankenstein and the Delphic Oracle of The Omega Seed by Paolo Soleri, Section 4:18. Tomorrow we will continue with Section 4:19. Until then, Alam.